In this video I shall argue that the analogy between moral and physical experiences often employed by Christian apologist and philosopher William Lane Craig is incorrect. First, objective moral truths are statements about the morality of deeds that are valid regardless of any subjective opinion about their truth. Such concept is employed to formulate various theistic arguments, following the reasoning that if God were non-existent, objective moral truths could not exist. Yet the existence of such truths is intuitively evident to us, and in the absence of a strong defeater, one is justified in believing they exist. Whether this intuition is strong enough that one would postulate the existence of a theistic deity in order to justify it is a matter of subjective opinion. I doubt the existence of objective moral truths because moral perceptions are ultimately based on emotions, not reason. Reason is important in constructing efficient moral frameworks. If a person, say, cares about enhancing as much conscious well-being as possible for as many beings as possible, then undoubtedly there are objectively good and bad ways to achieve such purpose. What I'm arguing is that after a process of introspection, at the very end this person will be unable to rationally justify why conscious well-being is valuable. The axiomatic basis of each moral framework is instead emotional. When questioned in depth about his moral perceptions, each individual will ultimately have to say, "I just feel this way."
But can I ask, just to follow up on that, because, I'm tempted to say I could play this game and that's unfair, because of course it's not a game, but I could pose the same kinds of questions to you, perhaps I will, in 10 minutes. I could say, look, all right, so God says, you guys are really, really special.
Right.
How does his saying it make us really special? But you see, he gave us a soul. How does our having a soul make us special? Whatever answer you give, you could always say, with regard to that, what's so special about that? At a certain point, you're just going to have to say, you know what? These features really do seem to me to be special. Insofar as it seems to me that our ability to communicate, to reflect, to love, to be creative, and consequently to shape our behavior with an eye towards how we're interacting with one another, these things strike me as remarkable ways in which we're special.
So, if moral frameworks are ultimately based on feelings, how can you affirm that your emotional perceptions are superior to another's? How could you rationally justify that assertion? It seems to me that moral disagreements, when axiomatic emotional perceptions are different, come down to being battles between irreconcilable wills. Those who instead try and argue for moral realism often do so by using what I consider poorly disguised appeals to consequences, or, and this is what I'm going to discuss now, analogies to our sensory experiences. As an example, listen to how William Lane Craig compares our experiences of the physical realm to the ones of the moral realm.
Your question, sir.
Hi, well, to do with the moral question as well. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. How do you justify that, in a sense? I do believe objective moral values exist, but it doesn't seem to me necessarily true. It seems to me equally likely, if I were an atheist, that nihilism is true. In other words, there are no objective moral values. Everything is just simply socially determined or whatever.
Yes.
As to objective moral values do exist. So how would you convince an atheist that actually no, they really do exist, as opposed to nihilism being true, apart from simply saying, well, that's very unpleasant?
I think that the second premise is necessarily true, but let's distinguish necessity from certainty. That is very important to do. Certainty is a property of persons. Necessity is a property of propositions. And some propositions can be necessary even though they're very uncertain. For example, some complicated mathematical equation will be necessarily true, if true, but we may be very uncertain about it. So the necessity of the second premise and the truth of the second premise doesn't require certainty. What reason would we have to believe that objective moral values and duties exist? Well, basically, it would be our moral experience. Just as we believe in the world of sense objects around us, physical objects, because we have a sense of them through our senses, so we can believe in the objective reality of moral values and duties on the basis of our moral experience. And any argument you run to be skeptical about our moral experience, I can run a parallel argument about why you should be skeptical about our experience of the physical world of objects around us. Maybe you're a brain in a vat of chemicals being stimulated by a scientist to think you're here in this lecture hall, listening to this lecture. Maybe you're a body lying in the matrix and you're inhabiting a virtual reality. In the absence of some reason to defeat your experiences, you're justified in believing in what those experiences teach you. And similarly, in the absence of a good defeater of our moral experience, I think we're justified in believing what that experience tells us. Louise Antony is an atheist philosopher who put it so well, I think. This is how she put it. Any argument for moral skepticism is going to be based upon premises which are less obvious than the reality of objective moral values themselves. And therefore, you would never be justified in accepting moral skepticism. I like that, and I think that's correct.
Thank you for the question.
This argument falls apart upon a brief analysis. First, the matrix and the lab scientist scenarios are not apt analogies to moral non-realism. In both scenarios, our sensory experiences are representative of an external reality. For example, in the lab scientist scenario, they are representative of the stimuli the scientist is giving to my brain. Such external reality isn't the one I intuitively assume it to be, but it's there, and even if I'm unable to correctly determine how it is, it's objective and mind-independent. On moral non-realism, moral perceptions are not representative of something external and objective, unlike the sensorial perceptions of the matrix and lab scientist scenarios. The scenario that would be most analogous to moral non-realism is one where every alleged sensorial perception of mine were to be nothing but a product of my mind, instead of being the result of a contact between my body and the external physical world, neither of which would actually exist. At this point, the analogy could be modified so to argue that just as I intuitively assume that what surrounds me is an actual world of physical objects rather than a creation of my mind, one is justified in assuming a moral realism rather than moral non-realism. However, I do not consider the physical world to be an apt analogy for moral realism, since while a reality of mind-independent physical objects is not incoherent, a set of axiomatic emotional perceptions that are more rationally justifiable than others is. In conclusion, I regard the analogy here examined as a misleading attempt to shift the burden of proof on moral skeptics.